Since this will be shown in each of the 5 towns involved in this race, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Sarah Duckett, and I am the editor and publisher of the Hopkins Independent newspaper. We have been hosting public debates to offer voters the opportunity to view candidates in local and state elections for nearly 9 years. Our first was over 8 years ago when Paul Lascoco was running for this 8th Middlesex State Representative seat. To some, this debate may seem a bit unorthodox since only one of the Democratic candidates is present. We have initially wanted this to be between the 2 Democratic candidates prior to the primary. The Mills campaign declined to participate, and Mr. Haley has offered to step in. There is no presumption on the part of the newspaper or HCAM that a Democratic candidate has already been selected. We would have preferred to have Mr. Mills participate for the benefit of the viewing audience. However, we are thankful to Mr. Haley for coming forward this evening to join Ms. Dykema in what we hope will be a spirited and enlightening discussion of the issues facing the state and our district. And I know the biggest question for each of the 3 candidates is, will you be continuing the senior picnics started by Barbara Gardner and continued by Paul Lascoco? Candidates are Carolyn Dykema from the Democratic Party, Dan Haley from the Republican Party. Our panel tonight is one short from our usual, but we have Jim Kleinkopf, a South Middlesex editor, Middlesex News, Michelle Michelle Murdoch, who writes for the Hopkinton Independent, and Tom Maroney, who's the bureau chief of Bloomberg News.
What are the voters' concerns, starting with the single most important one that you've heard the most from voters?
The property tax and the economy. People are being hit by all sides. The property tax is one direction from which they're being hit, but they're being hit by gas prices. They're being hit by prices at the grocery store. Before I get rolling, I have to say I will keep the senior picnic. I was there today, and I want to make sure I answered that because they feel very strongly, and it's a great event. The property taxes, everyone says when they're running for office, I'm going to lower property taxes. That's what our current governor said when he was running for office. Property taxes can only come down if local aid levels come up. The property taxes react inversely to levels of local aid. When cities and towns need to fund their services and don't get enough from the state, well, then you have Proposition 2.5 overrides, you have neighbor against neighbor, and so frankly, when the governor said he was going to lower property taxes, there's a simple way to do that, and we have not brought local aid levels up to the level they need to be.
Now, Dan, you say that this is a very simple problem. Let's explore that a little bit. You say simply bring more local aid to our communities. How do we do that?
Well, thank you for asking that question, because that is absolutely central to my message running. Our state government right now does not set priorities. If you listen to rhetoric coming out of Beacon Hill, everyone always says the same thing. We need new revenues to fund priorities, and priorities is defined as whatever a legislator wants to spend money on at any given time. Of course, if everything's a priority, then there is no true priority. The word has no meaning any longer. The priorities of state government ought to be education, public safety, transportation infrastructure, and providing for people who are truly needy, who truly need the government's help. And instead, we've got a government that spent $1 billion more than they budgeted for last year, even though record revenues came into the state. We've got a government that went into the budget cycle looking at $1 billion projected deficit for this year, and went behind closed doors and added $220 million worth of earmarked spending that no one could say what they were voting on when they came back into the chamber and bang, voted. And the chair of the Rules Committee, asked by a reporter to justify that, said, well, that's how the members like to do it. We live in a state right now where our government wastes our money and does not feel accountable to the voters, because most of them don't have challengers.
What I don't like, and I think what people are tired of, quite frankly, is this, the blame. I think people are done with trying to figure out why and how and who's to blame. I think what we need are constructive solutions that will set us on a better path.
I agree that people don't like people running for office pointing fingers, but frankly, money doesn't spend itself. $1 billion over benchmark in our government last year did not spend itself. People did that, and they did it behind closed doors, and you know what? There ought to be some blame to go around for that situation.
How are we going to provide the money that's needed for education?
Mr. Haley, you're up first.
Absolutely. Well, that comes right back to what I was saying before. It's the districts are strapped for cash. That's right. The state last year took in more cash in tax revenues than ever before in the history of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Now, that money is going places other than to local aid. In our last fiscal crisis, lottery funds are supposed to go back to cities and towns to fund education. In the last fiscal crisis, the legislature capped the level of funding that could come back to cities and towns to fund education because they wanted to keep more of that money for the general fund so that they can portion it out as they see fit. Now, the lottery aid, as we recovered from that last fiscal crisis, should have been uncapped, but it wasn't. The legislature refuses to do it because legislators like to have their hands on the money. They don't like to send it back to cities and towns.
I'd like to have a follow-up to Mr. Haley's comment about record revenues coming into the state, because I've talked to a couple of people who are very in touch with revenues at the state level, and they don't seem to understand where that number came from. Perhaps a question for another time.
I don't know who you're talking to. I'm reading the newspaper. Last year, $1.2 billion more than what's budgeted for came in. And I guarantee you they budgeted for what they expected to get. And they spent $1 billion more than what was budgeted for. So when you say that revenues aren't there, they are there. And there's no doubt about it. The country's in tough fiscal times, the state's in tough fiscal times. But in terms of the money coming into the state in tax revenue, it's coming in, it's just not coming back here. Everyone in Metro West is familiar with the Massachusetts Turnpike Authority, which literally hemorrhages money. It's the most inefficient organization you could possibly have, and the legislature refuses to fundamentally reform it or even to fundamentally analyze its operations because too many people, frankly, are related to legislators who work for the Turnpike Authority. But you've got money bleeding out of that agency, and this week, as a board member, last week as a board member resigned because the financial situation is so bad. Well, what did the administration do? They said, we're going to transfer money from Mass Highway to the Pike to bail it out, essentially. So you're taking taxpayer dollars from essentially an intact vessel and pouring them into a leaking vessel.
What would you cut so my town can get the local aid, so my property taxes can go down?
The notion that the only way you can solve the state's fiscal problems is to take a hatchet to various things that are important to people, I think is a false premise. During the last election cycle, both gubernatorial candidates agreed that a way to save hundreds of millions of dollars at the local level, hundreds of millions, would be to enact what's called municipal GIC. And this is a hard thing to explain, people's eyes glaze, but basically what it means is the state buys its insurance for its employees through a big pool because there's so many employees. They get a better rate than cities and towns, which buy for themselves, for their employees, gets by a good deal. You know, you have a bigger pool, you get a better rate. The estimates ran to the hundreds of millions of dollars from both candidates that if you just allowed cities and towns to opt to vote, to buy their insurance from the same pool as the state, you'd literally save cities and towns hundreds of millions of dollars. Governor Patrick came into office and he enacted municipal GIC, but he added a little kicker. And that little kicker gives municipal unions an absolute veto over a town's decision to join the municipal GIC, which means no cities and towns will join the municipal GIC. Those hundreds of millions of dollars are not saved.
The GIC issue is a good one. I think it's a good one that Dan's raised. My understanding of that issue is that we've got local unions that have bargained in good faith over the years, and their concern was that bargaining piece of the bargaining would be removed from their control.
It's an inevitable result, this situation, of a way of thinking on Beacon Hill. And frankly, Carolyn said something last week in Holliston where she said she had a business background, and she said, I'll tell you this, if you spend all your time watching your dollars and watching your receipts and expenditures, you're going to miss opportunities. I'll tell you, my point of view is taxpayers want someone watching their dollars.
Dan,